Stored procedures should usually be the first thing you think of from a development standpoint in SQL Server when you've got to provide functionality of almost any kind to a database. A stored procedure is similar to procedures or functions in other programming languages. We are simply going to take a group of transact SQL commands, give them a name, call the name to execute them. You can think of this as a batch file of transact SQL commands. What I'm going to do in the next few videos is step you through the process of creating stored procedures, using variables with stored procedures, a couple of other things, but you need to get a good grasp of stored procedures, and we'll talk about all kinds of reasons why as we go through here. But let's talk briefly here about the benefits of stored procedures in SQL Server. One of the first things is that they are stored on the server as an object in the database. Now this same thing applies for views as well. And what I want to do is jump out to the management console, and I want to show you, and if you remember back in the video on views where we're creating our views, if you'll notice within these databases, in the AdventureWorks databases, you'll notice that we have a views folder and we also have a programmability folder. And we're going to play with some functions a little bit later on, but notice we have stored procedures. Now stored procedures and views, for example, here's a stored procedure called log error. And I just want you to notice that if I right click and go to properties here, I can set permissions. So I can go in here and say, you know what, I want to choose whichever users, for example, public, and I can grant access to a particular stored procedure, this one, this log error, by going and giving people the ability, notice I can grant the execute permission to the public database role. So everybody who comes into this database can execute that stored procedure. I can do the same thing for views. If I right click on a view and go to properties, you will see permissions right here, and I can apply permissions to the view the same way. So views and stored procedures share that in common, and that is they are stored inside the database. What's cool about that is that since it's stored centrally in the database and I can apply permissions at the database level, I can also do updates at the database level, and this gives me modular programming because I can build stored procedures to do certain tasks. And if anything ever changes about the structure of my database or whatever, I can go make that change in that one central location, and then any user application that utilizes that stored procedure will automatically have those changes. Something else that happens, stored procedures reduce network traffic. Why? Think about this. I may have a stored procedure that has 450 lines of transact SQL code in it. Well, to call the stored procedure over the network, rather than pushing those 450 lines of T-SQL code to the SQL server to have it carry out those instructions, all I push across the network is the name of the stored procedure and any variables or parameters that I'm passing to it. Once that single call gets to the SQL server, then it accesses the 450 lines of code. So I've made a pretty significant reduction in the amount of network traffic that's had to been pushed to get that same functionality to happen. You need to understand that there are multiple types of stored procedures on SQL Server, but they all work very similarly. The first one I call transact SQL stored procedures. These are the ones that you and I create. These are saved collections of T-SQL statements that have been given a name, and I'm going to show you how to create one in a separate video. We also have CLR stored procedures. Now pay close attention to these. CLR stands for Common Language Runtime. With a CLR stored procedure, what we're really going to do is this just sets a reference from inside SQL Server to a .NET Framework piece of code sitting out there on the hard drive somewhere in a .NET assembly. Now those of you who are .NET Framework mad scientists, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and the light bulb's flashing. I can build whatever functionality I want to out there in C#, VB.NET, almost any language, and compile it up in the .NET Framework into an assembly and then call that functionality from inside SQL Server. That's some really cool stuff. The next one are extended store procedures, and these all have a prefix of XP on them. This is the old way to do CLR store procedures. These accessed external routines just like CLR queries do, but they're accessing these old DLLs that were built usually in C, C++, those kind of languages. And Microsoft wants this working in the .NET Framework now for a lot of reasons: security, code level, line level security, just a lot of other things that are really cool about .NET. Won't go into a whole bunch of .NET stuff now. One other thing you need to be aware of, the XP procedures are going to be phased out over the next few versions, and Microsoft's recommending that if you're going to build any kind of external functionality and then call it from inside SQL Server, you should use the CLR type stored procedures and get away from the XPs. Then we have system stored procedures. Now these are generally administrative type functionalities that are pre-programmed by Microsoft, and we have them. We can do all kind of cool stuff with them. And these are really neat. You need to go out there, just go into Books Online and type SP_, and you'll see a list of all kind of stored procedures that you can run to do all kind of really cool things. So that's the 5 or 6 minute introduction to stored procedures. In the next video, I am going to show you how to create a stored procedure, and then we'll start to talk about using variables and stored procedures and parameters and so forth. And we'll just kind of build on this as we go. But the light should really click on for you here about some really cool things you can do as a SQL database developer using these stored procedures.